Welcome to the second webinar sponsored by the Chevalier Institute, entitled An Exploration of Creation as God's Love Story. The Chevalier Institute is a part of the Australian province of the Roman Catholic Order, the Missionaries of the Sacred Heart. Our mandate is to offer faith formation to adults in spirituality of the heart. We welcome participants from all over Australia, and also very early in their morning from the USA and Rome and Brussels. The content explored during this webinar is drawn primarily from the encyclical letter of Pope Francis, Laudato Si, on care for our common home. This encyclical offers the human family the wisdom and mandate so desperately needed to enable us to be attuned to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, and to be drawn both personally and communally into the ecological conversion required to prevent catastrophe and to participate in the regeneration of creation. We have three speakers. Firstly, Krish Mathavan, MSc, who will draw us into the content of Laudato Si and connect that content with current climate science research. Krish will be followed by Claude Mostovic, MSc. Claude will highlight the connection between the ecological crisis and the levels of suffering, poverty and injustice that are present around the planet. He will draw us towards the integral spirituality that is at the core of Laudato Si. And finally, Anne McAtomney will explore ways of promoting ecological conversion and an orientation to justice and peace within a community or a workplace. There will be a short opportunity for questions after Claude has spoken, and a time for sharing reflective comments after Anne has concluded her presentation. If you'd like to ask a question, we invite you to submit your question in writing using the chat function on your screen. For the reflective response after Anne's presentation, click the raise your hand button and have your microphone turned on when we call your name. All questions and responses need to be short, and there will not be time to engage in follow-up discussion about your question. And so to begin, our webinar topic, Creation as God's Love Story, reminds us of the beauty and the mystery of creation. But we only have to look around to become aware of the fragility of that creation. This webinar is our attempt to offer a new dialogue about how we're shaping the future of our planet. And it's particularly directed towards we in the minority world who pollute and consume so much of creation's resources. We have the capacity and the duty to respond and act to protect our common home. We begin with an acknowledgement of the original custodians of the land on which we stand, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and of elders past and present in every place this webinar is being watched. Our First Peoples have understood forever how to respect and cherish the land from which we come, and still have much wisdom to share, if we would only listen. Thank you, John Bosman. Our opening prayer is adapted with permission from Margie Abbott's new book, Igniting Re-Enchantment with the Sacred, Cosmic Sparks. Laudate Si reminds us, every year hundreds of millions of tonnes of waste are generated, much of it non-biodegradable, highly toxic and radioactive, from homes and businesses, from construction and demolition sites, from clinical, electronic and industrial sources. Earth, our home, is beginning to look more and more like an immense pile of filth. So I invite you to close your eyes and reflect on the beauty of nature where you live, and imagine it for a moment destroyed by such waste. Also from Laudate Si, the human family is called to recognise the need for changes of lifestyle, of production, of consumption. Close your eyes and reflect. In what ways are you and I willing to change our lifestyles? There's been a tragic rise in the number of migrants seeking to flee from the growing poverty caused by environmental degradation. They're not recognised by international conventions as refugees. They bear the loss of the lives they've left behind without enjoying any legal protection whatsoever. Close your eyes and reflect. How must we respond? And so we ask, as we begin our webinar, may our eyes be open to become more aware of the environment that surrounds each one of us. May we tread consciously each day and breathe in the sacredness of all that is. And in this way, may we be God's heart on earth. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first presenter, Father Krish Mathavan. Krish is a missionary of the Sacred Heart, currently parish priest at St. Teresa's Parish in Moona, Tasmania. Krish has a PhD in genomics from the University of Singapore, and he believes that God first spoke through creation before speaking more definitively through the person of Jesus. And so it is with great pleasure that I invite Krish to present his reflections on Laudate Si.
Thank you, Alison. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. A warm shout out to parishioners from Moona, as well as friends and brother MSCs from Adelaide, Melbourne, Sydney, and beyond. Tonight, we'd like to explore with you a crucial and global issue on the care of our common home. It's an issue that brings together ecology, economics, climate science, and faith. And this initiative was deeply inspired by Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si, whose 5th anniversary of publication was just a month ago. It's the longest papal encyclical ever written, and at times it makes for dense reading, but definitely worth going back to read and reread. It presents a broad vision of reality and a compelling case of how climate change is the mother of all injustice. And it goes on to examine its root causes that go beyond the effects that we see. It's not an ideological document, but an invitation that goes to the heart of who we are, who we understand ourselves to be, and therefore it is addressed to the whole family, not just Catholics, for a new dialogue about how we are shaping the future of our planet. And this quote from paragraph 14 is right at the introductory section of Laudato Si. We are exploring this with you not because we are experts in the field, but we have either felt strongly enough about it to desire change to happen, and/or we have experienced the effects of this lack of care of our common home in the lives of others. In the last 3 months, our world has suffered a global pandemic of COVID-19, a virus from the coronavirus family, which has crossed the animal species barrier into humans, and therefore reflecting at its cause our lack of harmony with nature. The pandemic resulted in a parish lockdown for me, and I took the opportunity to read this document and learn from the global Catholic climate movement that was starting a course to form Laudato Si animators. As I read and learned from others, I became deeply inspired to do more. I am based in Hobart, in Tasmania, where the beauty of the natural world is all around me and accessible to most. Just a couple of photos, some hikes that I took before the lockdown, and this is of course the big one is Cradle Mountain and the beautiful Dove Lake, and a couple of walks in Mount Wellington into waterfalls and so forth. Just to give you a sense of how much beauty there is around me. My days off are often spent hiking in the bush, which invigorates and refreshes me because it slows me down and connects me back to the natural world. I've always had a sense of God's presence in nature, even if I had not myself been convicted to do more than just appreciate its beauty. In my stay in Australia these last 10 years, I've become more conscious of our vulnerability to more frequent extreme weather events, like floods, droughts, and bushfires, like those early this year, as well as our growing disregard for the environment, which we are more inclined to exploit than reverence. That gave me an impetus to promote an awareness of what is at stake and what we can do. And so with the help of Chevalier Institute, who brought us together, here we are. I like to see what we do here as starting or continuing a conversation, depending on where you are, and being part of a growing global movement that is working towards climate justice. The structure of Laudato Si follows the typical paradigm found within Catholic social teaching: see, judge, and act. To see is to have a deeper understanding of the natural world and the ecological crisis, and this corresponds to chapter 1 of the encyclical. I will attempt to summarize those insights and back it up with some of the latest scientific findings. The next step is to judge. So based on what we have seen, how do we understand the situation in light of our faith? And so we draw from the scriptures, Catholic social teaching, and our tradition of heart spirituality and constitutions to help us. And this corresponds to chapters 2 to 4 of the encyclical. I will allude briefly to these, and Claude will use that as a stepping stone to include other voices to the conversation. Finally, the third step is to act. After we have seen and judged, how do we put this into practice and bring our faith into action? This corresponds to chapters 5 and 6 of the encyclical, and will draw from the above collective wisdom to map out the faith or heart response of the school community that she works in. So let's begin. Hearing creation's song and cry, which really corresponds to the introductory section in chapter 1. Laudato Si means be praised or praise be, and comes from the beginning of St. Francis of Assisi's Canticle of the Creatures. As you can see from the lyrics, to burst into a song like this only happens when one is in love, in relationship. The song draws all creatures into our praise of God and brings glory to creation through the brotherly and sisterly bonds that we share. As we read through that, there is an openness to wonder as well as to intimacy. Birds, fire, and wind are our brothers. The moon, the stars, and water are our sisters. And our planet Earth, who nourishes us, is mother. So creation is nature viewed with the Creator in mind, and so creation becomes fraternity. And this is the basis of realizing how our sister Mother Earth now cries out to us because of the harm inflicted on her when we see ourselves as lords and masters instead of being brothers and sisters. Just a couple of quotes from the document. The violence present in our hearts, wounded by sin, is also reflected in the symptoms of sickness, evident in the soil, in the water, in the air, and in all forms of life. This is when we have our relationship with creation ruptured. We have forgotten that we ourselves are dust of the earth, from Genesis chapter 2, and our bodies are made up of her elements. We breathe her air, and we receive her nourishment. And Pope Francis concludes in paragraph 11, if we approach nature without this openness of St. Francis to awe and wonder, if we no longer speak the language of fraternity and beauty in our relationship with the world, our attitude will be that of masters, consumers, ruthless exploiters, unable to set limits on their immediate needs. And so we have the cry of the earth. What does that look like? I will show a couple of images and quotes from Laudato Si, and I invite you to take this time to just read through them and let the image speak to you. This is the result of what Pope Francis would call the throwaway culture that quickly reduces things that we consume into rubbish. Global warming and deforestation can in turn affect the availability of drinking water, a basic human right. It can also lead to an extinction of part of the planet's biodiversity, making the oceans more acidic, rising in sea levels with major consequences on those who live in coastal regions. And so we are talking about implications that are environmental, social, economic, and political. Every intervention in nature has consequences which are not immediately evident. Both everyday experience and scientific research show that the greatest effect of all attacks on the environment are suffered by the poorest. For example, the depletion of fishing reserves especially hurts small fishing communities without the means to replace those resources. Water pollution particularly affects the poor who cannot buy bottled water. And rises in sea level affect mainly impoverished coastal populations who have nowhere else to go. This is taken from paragraph 48. Dear friends, a lot of us, we do not see this. Thanks be to technology to show us what is happening in other parts of the world. But sometimes out of sight also leads to out of mind. And perhaps this brings us to one of the most important quotes in Laudato Si. This lack of physical contact and encounter with the poor encouraged at times by the disintegration of our cities, can lead to a numbing of conscience and to tendentious or biased analysis which neglect parts of reality. We have to realize that a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice in debates on the environment so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. And so it is a justice issue, not just environmental. It is said, in fact, that climate crisis is the mother of all injustice because those who are least responsible for this problem, the poor, are the worst affected. And this is closely linked with the world's wealth inequality. The countries where most wealth is concentrated are also the ones responsible for the greatest carbon dioxide emissions that have caused climate change. Perhaps that's a good segue to go into the science and what the science says to us. In 1992, 1,700 independent scientists signed the World Scientist Warning to Humanity. It warned that human beings and the natural world are on a collision course. And if environmental damage was not stopped, our future was at risk. Now the world still faces daunting environmental challenges. And so we have environmental scientist William Ripple and his colleagues who decided to create a new letter in 2017, 25 years later, that essentially says that if there is not a groundswell of public pressure to change human behavior, the planet will sustain substantial and irreversible harm. And so more than 15,000 scientists from 184 countries have signed this second warning to humanity. This is far from a lone voice crying out in the wilderness. And of course, we also have the historic Paris Agreement on Climate Change that came out in December 2015, a few months after Laudato Si, that aimed to maintain the average increase in the planet's surface temperature well below 2 degrees and to intensify efforts to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees. And so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, which is the United Nations body for assessing the science related to climate change, it identifies where there is agreement in the scientific community on topics related to climate change and where further research is needed. And so the IPCC came out with a special report in 2018 on the logic and feasibility of the 1.5 degree limit. And you know what? It gave the world less than a 5% chance of keeping to this limit based on current rates of progress. That's not exactly the most encouraging of stats. But the science is clear. These are a couple of figures from that report that hopefully are simple enough to understand. The science is clear that the Earth's climate system only has a certain carbon budget or carrying capacity for carbon dioxide emissions. In truth, we can only emit a further 420 gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere, which is not huge because we release close to 40 gigatons a year. And beyond that, we start to interfere with the very systems which make life as we know it possible. At present, we are still using up this budget at an astonishing rate. And so from the left graph, if we look at the current trend of 3 to 4 degrees global warming, we'll be releasing up to 4,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide. And we will have effectively used up the budget by 2035, based on projection using complex climate models. If we keep to 1.5 degrees, it is much more sustainable. We emit less than 1,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide. Now we know what is causing this. That science is not so complicated. The burning of fossil fuels is by far the biggest source of carbon dioxide pollution. 80% of remaining fossil reserves need to stay in the ground if we are not to exceed a 1.5 degree warming. And so to the graph on the right, really we're looking at global temperature change since the Industrial Revolution in the early 18th century. And so we can see right up to 2017, where this report was written, there has been almost a 1 degree rise in global warming. And if we keep to it, it will keep going. What we're trying to do, and this will be familiar language, I think, to most of us now, is we are trying to flatten the curve. If we keep it to 1.5 degrees, then the global warming will hopefully stay there. And we need to take measures, of course, but if we don't do anything, the global warming will just keep going. And so we're really looking at 1.5 degrees as just a very narrow window, and we have only about 8 years left for the curve to start flattening. Because at 2018, when the report was released, they said by 2028, we need to start flattening that curve. And so we are talking about a very small window of opportunity and urgency at this. This is also another chart, and this has to do with events in Australia, charting the summer, the very hot summer in 2012, the bushfires then, the coral sea bleaching in 2016, as well as the drought in 2006, and looking at the associated impacts and how natural it will be without any human-induced change. But based on our current climate, much more often it will be. And we keep the 1.5 degrees, it is still manageable every 2 years, every 2 to 3 years. But if we go higher, it will be more frequent. And again, this is based on projections from climate models. And while there is variation in all of that, largely the increase in what we see on the ground with global warming matches that's predicted. And so we all have to do something. Already this year's global temperature maps show an ominous warming region across a huge area of Siberia and Central Asia. That corresponds to the dark red region right there. For most of this century, this Arctic Circle has been warming twice as rapidly as the world overall. But this year, the mean temperature in May for some centers within the Arctic Circle was up to 10 degrees above average. And this is likely due and leading to the volume of ice covering the Arctic Ocean melting by half over the last 40 years. In March this year, the United Nations warned that 2020 will be a pivotal year in which the world's ever-rising emissions will have to begin coming down if we were to avoid a catastrophic climate future. Well, talk about good timing. A week or two later, with COVID-19 forcing economies everywhere to shut down, emissions suddenly started dropping. In fact, it has been forecast that global emissions will drop by at least 4% this year. This is just a picture of the emissions of nitrous oxide, a greenhouse gas above China, before COVID-19 and after COVID-19. I'm sure most of us have seen how the air is clear in many parts of the developing world because of the shutdown of the economy. In addition, people working from home, having online meetings, have helped to cut down on fossil fuel intense commutes by car, by plane, giving rise to cleaner airs and waters, with animals even returning to reclaim their habitat. Now, this downward curve might be short-lived if leaders choose to restart their economies back to business as usual. But we do need functioning economies to develop the technologies and systems so that we can hopefully reach zero carbon emissions. The pandemic showed it is possible to act fast and urgently when something of immediate concern demands it. Hopefully, more people, especially our leaders, can start to see the climate crisis as an immediate burning crisis now and take immediate and strong action. Now that's on the level of government and all, but what can we do individually that is effective and sustainable? Well, there's some science behind this. A new scientific study in 2017 identified the top 3 lifestyle actions that would have the greatest impact on an individual's greenhouse gas emissions. And these 3 lifestyle actions are eating a plant-based diet, avoiding air travel, and living car-free. The study analyzed 13 peer-reviewed articles, carbon calculators, and government sources to quantify the most high-impact personal lifestyle choices in developed countries. The study found that, on average, eating a plant-based diet saves about 0.8 tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year. Each round-trip transatlantic flight avoids and saves 1.6 tons, and living car-free for a year saves 2.4 tons. Now, to put this in context, per capita carbon dioxide emissions should not exceed 2.1 tons annually by the year 2050, if the goal of limiting global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees is to be achieved. And so it's interesting that all three lifestyle options are more effective than just merely recycling and using cold water in our washing. We have the lifestyle solutions, but we also have structural solutions like replacing our typical car with a hybrid car or electric car, or using renewable energy at home. I like this graph. I just think it just shows that each of us can respond to this crisis. It's not out of our hands just yet, but it does boil down to the choices that we make, the way we live, how much we consume, what we purchase. It's not like we are calling you to sell your car or become a vegetarian, but simply we can choose lifestyle or structural solutions right now. And we can start small and scale it up as appropriate. And so just something there to know that there is science behind what we do can make a difference. Just to end my part of the sharing, going deeper, this is corresponding to chapters 2 and 3 of Laudato Si. The deeper human roots of the crisis of our common home has to do with the place of human beings in the world. There are many positive elements of technology, like how this webinar was made possible with people from all over the world. But the technological paradigm has become so dominant, it will be difficult to do without its resources, and even more difficult to utilize them without being dominated by the internal logic. And that logic is one of exploiting nature, one of valuing human nature only by its productivity. In a way, we have become slaves of this dominant technocratic paradigm, trusting it to solve all our problems. What is behind this giving up of our freedom and power to technology? And Pope Francis talks about two elements. One is modern anthropocentrism, which is human beings at the center. We are at the center of everything. We think we live in total independence and absolute centrality. We become the only point of reference, and all else becomes relative. So it's all about us and not about everything else around us. And so we don't see ourselves as beings in relationship, whether it's with God, with others, and with creation. It is really all about us. And so every decision has to do with what we want. Another element of this paradigm is the mechanistic vision of the natural world. The way we look at the world as a machine and as a storehouse of resources to extract everything we want at will. Mining, logging, and the like, they're all part of extracting our resources from the world. And so this gives rise to a modern economy of use, produce, waste, and throw. Focus on how to compete to increase wealth and economic growth. I really like this slide. That worldview we could call an ego worldview because it is all about us and we are at the top of the pyramid. But this is in contrast to the vision of the earth as God's creation, as God's love story. And we can call that the eco worldview. This theological vision of the natural world is described in scriptures, especially in the book of Genesis, and certainly lived out by St. Francis at the beginning of this sharing. What it says is this: creation is inherently good. It is an act of God's love and the sacrament, the very sacrament and revelation of God. And so creation is God's love story. And so every living thing has intrinsic value. Doesn't matter whether it is of use to us economically or not. And so when we abuse creation, we then disrespect the Creator. And so at the deepest level, Pope Francis would describe the ecological crisis as a profoundly spiritual and religious crisis, as well as a moral crisis, because it affects disproportionately our poor brothers and sisters of our common family. And so here we have a thing called ecological sin. It disrupts the three most fundamental and closely intertwined relationships with God, with each other, and with the earth. And this is shown in Adam and Eve's disobedience to God, resulting in them pointing blame at each other and being banished from the garden. It is in contrast to God's vision of universal communion with the human family and the whole of creation, as described in the words in paragraph 89. As part of the universe called into being by one Father, all of us are linked by unseen bonds, and together we form a kind of universal family, a sublime communion which fills us with a sacred, affectionate, and humble respect. We need to change our worldviews, and this eco-worldview is called integral ecology by Pope Francis in the later half of Laudato Si, and Claude will develop that notion for us next. And so to conclude, Laudato Si certainly can provide a moral and spiritual compass for the journey to create a more caring, fraternal, and sustainable world. We have in fact a unique opportunity now to transform the present groaning of creation as we go out of this pandemic into the birth pangs of a new way of living together in harmony with creation as God's love story, to care for our human home. Let's do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Krish, for those inspiring words. So let's take a couple of minutes, and I would invite you, before we move on too quickly, to try and catch and capture the essential elements of where Krish has drawn us. Perhaps you might like to make some notes, and possibly you have a question. The question time will be after Claude, but you might like to go to the Q&A, not the chat, but the Q&A section, and write a question if you wish. But for now, let's take a couple of minutes to just allow Krish's words to permeate our beings, our hearts and our minds. So it gives me great pleasure now to introduce Father Claude Mosterwick. Claude is a missionary of the Sacred Heart and is currently promoter for peace, justice and ecology for the MSC. He's national president and New South Wales convener of Pax Christi Australia, and he holds the desk for publications and research for the Edmund Rice Centre for Justice and Community Education. Claude holds academic qualifications in theology and psychology, and he will invite us to be more attuned to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. Thank you, Claude.
Thank you very much, and welcome to all our listeners, whoever they are, wherever you are, and thanks to Krish for his great presentation. So it's creation as God's love story. There's a little meme that I've found recently. It says when we recognize that heart and earth contain the same letters, then things begin to make sense. Laudate Si reminds us that we all share a common home and need to recognize the inherent sacredness and goodness and value of the material world. And Pope Francis says that we share a small interconnected planet which can be realized in relationship with all creation, all people, and our Creator. The words by Wendell Berry somehow would capture much of what Pope Francis is trying to tell us in Laudate Si. Wendell Berry is an American farmer and philosopher, and he says there are no unsacred places. There are only sacred places and desecrated places. Francis knows that something invariably stirs in us when we stop to look around us with the eyes of wonder, what he often calls the contemplative gaze, or loving look, where we begin to see more deeply into the beauty of ordinary things and recognize that our world is not just a useful resource, a place to live on, to supply with food, to be exploited for our benefit, to be plundered at will, and then to be left behind as we head for heaven. He goes on to say she's a living, breathing, precious entity to be cherished daily. And only when we begin behaving as though the earth is our true home does it really begin to feel like one. With this in mind, Francis calls for a change of heart, or what we call sometimes a conversion of heart, both individually and communally in response to the love story of creation. It's a call to all people of faith and no faith who seek justice and integrity of creation. The Pope appeals for a new dialogue about the planet's future, as we've already heard from Krish, where everyone is included in the conversation because the environmental challenge we are undergoing and its human roots concern and affect us all. We need an honest and open debate where narrow interests do not prejudice the common good, which exclude and marginalise our most vulnerable sisters and brothers. The change of heart involves amplifying the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. And by listening to these cries, Francis tries to awaken the consciences of all, especially the economically and politically powerful, awakening their consciences to the plight of the poor and the now impoverished earth, as we've heard. At heart, the larger problem is the failure to recognise that we are all, everyone and everything, are interconnected. So a sense of deep communion with the rest of nature cannot be real if our hearts lack tenderness, compassion, and concern for our fellow human beings. This compromises the very meaning of our struggle for the sake of the environment. Everything is connected, and concern for the environment thus needs to be joined to a sincere love for our fellow human beings and an unwavering commitment to resolving the problems of society. Pope Francis is promoting, as I see it, and I think it's been stated by others too, a radical new form of care for creation, a radical refusal to objectify reality that can be used and controlled. It's about care. We use the word stewardship at times, but stewardship still implies domination and control, whereas care approaches the earth with an attitude of awe and wonder, or as I said before, contemplative gaze. rather than acting like masters and consumers and ruthless exploiters who cannot set limits on their immediate needs. Where we feel intimate connections with all that exists, then I think that care can well up spontaneously. For Francis, the concept of integral ecology weaves all of life together. He says the entire material universe speaks of God and God's love, His boundless affection for us. And soil, water, mountains, everything is, as it were, a caress of God. The poet John Muir somehow captures this as well when he expresses it this way: when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. And so because everything is connected, concern for the environment thus needs to be joined in a sincere love for our fellow human beings and an unwavering commitment to resolving the problems of society. Integral ecology is the connection between respecting human dignity and caring for the natural world. And this awareness can awaken us to the painful reality, as we've seen, of ecological sins that harm the most vulnerable people, where environmental destruction impacts on some communities more than on others, particularly people who are living in poverty, Indigenous communities, and communities of colour. We know all are vulnerable, as we've heard, but some are more vulnerable than others. Theologians like Leonardo Boff, along with Pope Francis, of course, have joined the cry of the earth with the cry of the poor. And when we see the interconnectedness of all creation, we see how we have fallen short. It takes different eyes, a deeper capacity to listen, and an open heart. God's voice is heard in our hearts, but also through the lives of other people. And it requires careful listening and respect, because we all have something to say. It's the most privileged and sacred places that God's voice is heard. It's through the needs and the sufferings of others. God is always trying to get us to pay attention to all forms of injustice. And the suffering must be allowed to speak. This cry is a call for attention, a demand for an immediate response. And these are the cries of the wretched of the earth combined with the earth itself. And there's an intimate relationship between the poor and the fragility of the planet. It's not a simple call to action on climate change, where dialogue and discussion leads to deeper dialogue on the world's moral and political agenda. Today, in view of the common good, there's an urgent need for politics and economics to enter into a frank dialogue in the service of life, especially human life. We need, a dialogue about the distorted values of consumer culture, the power of multinational corporations, and the abuse of power that sees people and creatures as objects to be used, and that puts technology on a pedestal. So as we've heard, Laudate Si is about our common home and our place in it. It's not a new Christian manifesto where the Pope has come down decisively on the side of global green politics, but it's a renewal necessary for a respectful relationship with all living beings. It's about the sacredness of human life and our obligation to responsibly tend the garden of the world, including all plants and animals. There have been concerns that the Church is meddling in controversial politics and science, but that suggests to me that the Pope has hit a nerve by speaking truths that many would like to hide. and avoid a long-needed revolution. But we see there's no pandering here. For example, where there is agitation for the unborn, this cannot be treated separately and differently and separated from social systems that marginalise and brutalise people. Laudate Si manifests a faith that walks as it synthesises the human sciences, as we've heard already, including ethics and ecology, spirituality and society. Addressing one of the most critical moments in human history, it's been labelled explosive, prophetic and bold. It's directly addressed, as I said before, to all people, all who will listen and want to participate in caring for God's creation. The call for a renewed and deepened humanity is an assertive call, as I said earlier, for dialogue that will shape our lives for decades to come. So things do need to change, and we need to go beyond asking the crude questions as to the cost of acting or not acting, to asking the value of respecting the earth with profound responsibility. As a mere policy document or formula for political partisanship, Laudate Si would have a short shelf life. It's about transforming hearts that lead to action. An awareness of the gravity of today's cultural and ecological crisis needs to be translated, as we will hear later, into new habits. It's not about rules or strictures. The call is to open our minds and to have open hearts in order to be attentive to God's gift of creation, gift of love. And creation, like the four Gospels that have been written, draws us into the story of God's wondrous acts of love and salvation. And that's what connects us to all living things. Throughout history, religious congregations were founded on the basis of seeing and being present to the needs of the poor. Now our eyes are directed to be open towards the care for the poor and for the earth itself. Prayer and spirituality open us to advocacy and strengthen us for the biblical call to care. In recent years, there's been a call for a renewed relationship between Christian spirituality and socio-political concerns that lead to an important conversation with today's urgent social, political, and economic issues. And it's been expressed in various ways, like mysticism and politics, or contemplation and prophecy, or mysticism and resistance. Johannes Baptist Metz, a German theologian who died last year, talks about a mysticism of the open eyes as being a true response to suffering. It's a way of seeing more and more deeply, not less. It makes visible suffering what is often made invisible and inconvenient. It pays attention to suffering and takes responsibility for that unjust suffering. And this suffering of the other was, as we know, the focus of Jesus' life. It means we must acknowledge the absolute, as I see it, authority of the victims. A true spirituality must awaken us to the reality of a suffering earth and people. And this spirituality, unlike dogmas and religious and secular hierarchies, gives us an actual experience of the unity of all things. Suffering becomes visible. We cannot turn our backs to the invisible or to what is rendered invisible. Amnesia about past injustices and sufferings, or apathy in the face of present injustice and suffering, cannot be sustained. And so I repeat, the authority of those who suffer, the crucified peoples, becomes absolute over the claims to ultimacy of churches and religions. And opening one's eyes to the suffering of others and to our earth must culminate in a liberating action of compassion and mercy. And Father Metz calls it a political compassion. It entails a confrontation with all that commodifies people and God's creation. The concrete and practical application of Laudate Si came in October last year with the special synod of bishops for the Amazon, after 2 years of listening sessions held throughout the 9 Amazon countries, comprising the world's most diverse and critical ecosystems and the threats that they face. The participants included Indigenous leaders, bishops, priests, religious, turned their attention to the crises of deforestation, mining, biodiversity loss and dispossession, as well as land disputes that confront the region. The cry of the earth and the cry of the poor were heard at that synod. And it came out in a document called Querida Amazonia, or Beloved Amazon. The church showed that it was not only standing here, but sitting with Indigenous communities in defense of their rights and protecting the rainforest from destructive, unrestrained industrial development. Querida Amazonia reinforced Laudate Si in the awareness that everything is connected and that ecology and social justice are intimately related. The interlocking nature of injustice, the intersection of class, race, and gender is clear. The imperial fantasy of endless power, the capitalist fantasy of endless growth, and the technological fantasy of endless comfort must be abandoned. The arrogant fantasies fostered by political and economic systems do not benefit the majority. Systems that celebrate domination, unlimited growth, and inequality are in fact death cults and not the basis for justice and sustainability. We must firmly acknowledge the role of protection and care and connection of the Indigenous peoples around the world with nature and with creation. They, with creation and the Earth's resources, are integrally connected. We live only because we are cradled by the loving web of life that God wove out of that creation. And we must now hold creation among the poor and the sick whom we seek to serve. COVID-19 has forced us to focus on the centrality of life. In the struggle to face the direct health challenges of keeping people alive, we fail to see that we also have the powerful capacity to destroy some or most life on the planet. Laudate Si has pointed to the fact that we live in a period where human individualism and self-gratification have caused irremediable damage to our common home. Unlike Indigenous people, we have not understood our place in the world and our relationship with nature. We can, as we've already heard, create a more sustainable world. Everything from everyday acts to corporate investing and international advocacy matters to save our common home and all life. God's call to care for creation takes on a new life within our MSC charism that constantly calls for a transformation or a conversion of heart. Edwin Wilson says, a change of heart occurs when people look beyond themselves and then to the rest of life. It is strengthened when they also expand their view of landscape from parish to nation and beyond, and their sweep of time from their own lifespans to multiple generations, and finally to the extended history of humankind. Clearly, our spiritual values and our daily actions must be connected. Environmental destruction impacts, as I've said over and over again, the poor and marginalised community, often the first and more acutely. Though Pope Francis never uses the term environmental justice, it's implicit when referring to the violence perpetrated upon the earth and its effects on people. One definition of environmental justice has been offered by Robert Bullard, who says it's the principle that all people are entitled to equal environmental protection, regardless of race, colour, or national origin. It's the right to live and work and play in a clean environment. And of course, that includes air quality, clean water, living income, housing, healthcare, and education, often unavailable to communities and peoples who are living on the peripheries. The COVID-19 pandemic struck at a time that climate scientists say is critical to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Christina Figueres, a former UN climate chief with the IPCC that Chris referred to, says that the pandemic provides an unprecedented opportunity to press the reset button and to prove that we have learned from our mistakes of the past, to prove that in reflection of who we really are and our Creator, that we can actually act with much more responsibility, with much more solidarity, and with much longer vision, and that we are entirely capable of making decisions to build back better. The collision of the COVID-19 pandemic with climate change demands solutions that will address both. A change to the current economic development model is required. It's incompatible. If economic growth is based on destroying our source of life, the economic response should be reframed from a recovery to a regeneration. Recovery cannot return to what was before. The current COVID-19 pandemic could lead to a new way of seeing and of being and of doing. I've already mentioned Pope Francis' invitation to learn and understand with a contemplative gaze upon creation. Laudate Si is even more relevant now as I see it. COVID-19 on the back of climate change shows even more poignantly the cracks in the planet we inhabit, as suggested in Laudate Si and seen so clearly in our first presentation. We need a paradigm shift, a shift towards an earth-centered economics, politics, and culture. So spirituality is needed that is concrete, incarnate, and expressed as taking responsibility. Earlier, as I said, I mentioned political compassion. It must have arms and legs. It's about heart. The sense of awe and reverence or contemplative gaze for creation is vital for an ecological conversion where we discover, as the Pope says, a loving awareness that we are not disconnected from the rest of creatures, but joined in a splendid universal communion. So it calls for a spirituality of peace that is earth-centered and steers away from all forms of conflict. It shows that there are alternatives to the economic normal, towards alternatives found, as already hinted, in Indigenous cultures and local economies, where people are already defending with their lives. The spirituality of peace requires a paradigm shift that begins with the recognition, as I've said, that we are part of nature, not its masters or owners, that we are part of the earth family, and that we have the responsibility to care for all life on earth in all its beautiful diversity. Here lies the imperative to live, produce, and consume with ecological limits without encroaching on the rights of other species and peoples. The artificial or false categories in politics of unlimited economic growth, free trade, consumerism, and competitiveness need to be put in their place. It means challenging systems on which capital, corporations, and growth are founded, and which unleash destructive forces upon the earth. So let us appreciate God's wonders by sympathizing with the God of love, to resist whatever degrades people or creation, to have God's passion for the world's flourishing, which begins with the person next to us, especially the neighbour in need. And so this means that we must look at our images of God. Clearly, we need to see that the God of creation is reflected in the human Jesus. It's a call for a spirituality of the heart, a heart of flesh. It's a spirituality of relationship that incorporates liberation, spirituality, and many of the feet connect ways of relating, of being, and taking responsibility. It's a way of looking from below, from the underside, from the forgotten side, and the unheard or invisible side. And it critiques structures built on power for a few and powerlessness for the majority. It refuses to climb pyramids, being competitive, and works to form circles, solidarity, cooperation, and interdependency. And this has consequences for political, social, and economic policy. It means a compassionate engagement with this world that consists of respect for otherness, equality, and mutuality. All said, the interdependence and care that we are called to is where the deepest and most authentic desires of the human heart are made public and concrete. And this is what reflects us, for me, the loving God of creation amongst us. Thank you.
Thank you, Claude. Thank you very much for another amazing presentation. There's been a couple of comments, one of which is a question about whether the text of Krish and Claude and Anne's talks will be available, and we will find a way to offer you those texts. And if you keep your eye on Facebook, then we'll tell you where to go to find them. There's now an opportunity for a couple of questions, and we have already received a couple of wonderful questions. While you're catching your breath from Claude, I'd like to read a couple of reflective comments that have come in. One from Jerry Maynard, and she says, a realisation more than a question. A lot needs to be done to explore the communion with the environment as seen, experienced, lived and loved by Indigenous people. What a wonderful gift of grace they have. And from Narita Perotta, creation is an act of God's love which makes things, including ourselves, to be what they are rather than not be at all. As a product of that love, Narita asks us each, how much more are we prepared to not be anymore? So, Krish, can I ask you a question? And this question comes from Anne Marmion. Anne asks, how do we overcome the strength, the negativity, and the demonisation towards those concerned with climate change and those who speak out against the throwaway culture and the damage this is causing to our common home? So in other words, how do we overcome the voices of detraction? Krish?
Yes, I do believe that the messenger is the message at times when it comes to climate change. It has been hijacked by ideology somewhat, and people have not given into dialogue that Claude was talking about. Rather, it's just been violence and arguments. I think it's what Claude had said as well. So it's a matter of the heart, the ecological conversion that is needed. So for those who are concerned with climate change, reaching out to those who are not, I think it's a matter of really well, you can present the science as I have done and the theology, but perhaps what really would change a person would be an experience of nature, of the cry of the earth, the cry of the poor, of a personal experience of something of that. It could happen in the beauty of nature by myself. It could happen if I was working with the poor people or climate refugees, and I get to find out firsthand the suffering of people. Or it could happen even in terms of health, that the pollution that is out there is causing ill health, and there's also a lot of science in that too. Fossil fuels burning, biomass burning, and all that. And perhaps with in regards to health, one can start to persuade those who are a bit stronger against climate change and the throwaway culture. I think it's when I think hearts can be open in that sense. So really an experience of the cry or the song of the earth and the poor.
Thank you, Krish. Claude, would you like to briefly add anything to that?
Yes, thanks, Krish, for your comments there. One of the things science, can maybe, and all the information can sometimes convince people of some need for change. But I think also from my experience with some people from the Pacific and other areas who have been very much affected by damage to their environment and loss of culture and so on. It's the stories, hopefully, that will also touch the hearts of people. It's another aspect that if we can actually be open to listening to those cries, those stories, because they're the experts, they're the real experts of what's happening to them, and it also touch people's hearts.
Thank you, Claude. We have a question from Andre Klossens. Andre is in Rome, and Andre asks a question, and he says the dicastery for integral human development is inviting communities, parishes, schools to divest of fuel energy. How do we foster effective initiatives among the Chevalier family and the wider Church, Christian, Catholic communities? Krish, can I start with you?
Yeah, I saw that pamphlet about the dicastery offering the action platform for I think a 7-year plan for dioceses, schools, universities, hospitals to be Laudato Si, to be inspired and by that spirituality and integral ecology. It is a long-term plan. I know over here in Muna, I think there are a few people that are I guess starting to be interested to want to do more to make our environment more sustainable. And certainly with the school that we have on site, they are already a few steps ahead of us, having their own veggie garden and all that. So I can see potential collaboration between parish and school here. And as a fact, this will have to begin from the local level, the ground up. At the same time, it can also happen top down if leadership would take on this to see the need for converting a whole diocese or a whole religious community into a Laudato Si inspired one, and of course involving the lay MSCs and everyone else who can work together. Again, this is a call out for everyone to be involved, and I think that the dicastery has offered a structure for us. We can all start to respond to it from where we are, and certainly you'll hear that from a school's point of view from Anne in a while. So yeah, I think we'll just have to do it where we are and get people who are interested on board, and then we start to, I guess, reach out and network.
Thank you, Krish. I think we need to move on. We have a number of questions that are asking the practical response to the material that we've just heard, and that perhaps is a very neat segue into our third presentation from Anne McAtomney, and hopefully those questions that we were not able to answer will be somewhat addressed by the more practical and down-to-earth content in Anne's presentation. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Anne McAtomney, who is currently Assistant Principal on Mission at Downlands College and MSc College in Toowoomba. A significant aspect of Anne's role is to encourage a social justice focus within her school community. Anne is a wife, a mother, and a grandmother. She is a teacher of English, French, and religious education and holds postgraduate qualifications in theology and teaching English to speakers of other languages. So, Anne, it is with great pleasure that I welcome you and invite you to draw us into the more practical aspects of this question.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you, Alison, and good evening, everyone. So many wonderful and insightful words from Father Krish and Father Claude this evening. My part now is to convey some thoughts about possible ways to build or even strengthen a culture of social justice consciousness in faith communities, including and especially as this concerns Pope Francis's call to ecological conversion and to seeing creation as God's love story. As Alison mentioned, the context with which I am most familiar is my workplace, the faith community of a Catholic co-educational boarding school owned and conducted by the Missionaries of the Sacred Heart, Downlands College, a faith community in a beautiful setting, I might add, comprising students from years 4 to 12 and inclusive of the parent faith community. My hope this evening is that the ways, whys and wherefores of which I will speak may be both helpful and applicable in other faith communities in the wider MSc family, be they school, various groups, or the parish context. And I should say that, as I have already done, from here on I will refer to the Missionaries of the Sacred Heart as MSc. So in the case of my context, what impels us and informs our words and actions around social justice is to be found in the gospel messages in several of the MSc constitutions, namely Constitutions 13, 21, 22, and 32. And we can see some of those at the moment and the beautiful and pertinent words in those that inform our stance around social justice and ecological conversion. Humility, simplicity, justice and concern for all, especially the very poor. Will be attentive to those who suffer and are in need, identify the causes of their suffering, discern what our response will be by following the light of the gospel. Also, in the poor and the little ones, in all the victims of injustice and violence, will discover the face of Christ, will show compassion, work courageously to guarantee their human rights, to change the hearts of their oppressors. And then in Constitution 32, that our spirit is one of kindness, compassion, humility, and simplicity. In other words, and most importantly, it's the charism, and in this case, the MSc charism that both generates the spirit and informs the ethos of our faith community. That is one permeated by spirituality of the heart, a spirituality that is so much about the heart as the place of conversion, and which therefore constitutes an immeasurable richness in terms of pointing the way for the community to fulfill the call and responsibility to care for the earth and its people. And in what may seem somewhat of a contradiction, it is the deeply contemplative aspect of heart spirituality that can inspire concrete and compassionate engagement and action around peace and justice issues, and which can evoke, in Bishop Long's words, lament, repentance, efforts to repair damage done, and the transformation of behaviour that are all elements in the process of conversion. And clearly the words of Pope Francis in Laudato Si and in all his commentary about the environment, but that of our own hearts and around us in nature, find strong resonance with those just now highlighted in the constitutions. The call in our MSC family is to bring the community and the individuals in it to view the earth and our place in it with, to use Father Claude's words, different eyes, with the heart lens that is integral to the heart spirituality we profess. In the context of the MSC family, we're also blessed for the wisdom we can find in so many other words and phrases in the writings of the founder, Jules Chevalier, and in other MSCs whose focus is matters of the heart. Words about transformation of heart and conversion of heart, tenderness, humility, simplicity, compassion, beauty of the earth, to be on earth the heart of God, and to then make deep meaning from them for our community. No doubt there is similar richness to be found in faith communities with other charisms, and of course the words of Jesus in the scriptures are foundational and are there for all. I would like to describe some of the practical ways in which one can go about creating or strengthening a social justice consciousness in a faith community with ecological conversion, transformation of heart always integral to this consciousness. Before that, however, there are some deep understandings to be taken into consideration. And here, naturally, I need to draw on examples from my own MSC community context. But these ought to be applicable in other faith communities as well. Firstly, the person in the faith community with responsibility for building this consciousness, be it someone in an overarching mission or identity role, or someone whose specific focus is the social justice aspect of that larger role, or a group, or a parish leader, must have a genuine passion for the cause. To use Daniel O'Leary's words, a passion for the possible. And if others are to follow, then walking the talk, tiring as it can be, and giving personal witness to this is essential. There must be an understanding that everyone who is part of the faith community may be considered to be part of the social justice team, if you like. In the words of Dr. Kathy Day, our mandate and call is to be alternate community to death-dealing, postmodern, secular culture, and so convey the conversion message with courage, conviction, and hope to our young people. This is especially important for our young people. The message needs to be about awareness, urgency, responsibility, action, and hope, not darkness, hopelessness, and guilt. Just as for our microcosm of it in schools, we do not live in a perfect world, but we can always be on the way. There must be an understanding that just as for all aspects of a mission role in a faith community, the message, that is social justice consciousness, inclusive of ecological conversion as integral to it, needs to be embedded and continually woven, simply and consistently, into all aspects of the culture of the faith community. And at the same time, there is also a need to understand that in doing so, it's important to know one's community and be sensitive to the nature of it. For example, the workload of teachers and students in a school, stages of moral development of young people from empathy through to compassion, and so be measured and discerning. There are so many possible focus areas. Often it can be better to attend to a few areas well rather than many badly, and so lose people along the way. A further understanding is that in bringing social justice matters to people's attention, it may be wise to gently make the links between poverty and injustice and environment for the community, and to understand that for many this may be a journey into a field previously little thought about or understood. Important links may be, for example, the link between Laudato Si and the community's charism and otherwise words some of which in the context of my MSc family are: in the search for truth, we have a responsibility in an MSc school to offer a vision of hope for humankind, together with the words of the founder, Chevalier, as we strive to evoke a response in every human heart. Other words that come to mind here are those of Father Bob Irwin, MSc, that as MSc people we believe in a love that is hopeful yet not blind to the problems of our world. There needs to be an understanding that to think global and act local can often be the most realistic pathway for a faith community, and conversely the not only but also phrase applies. The community can become aware of, for example, war and starvation in Yemen, or disaster in Cox's Bazar, or the plight of refugees floating around the world's oceans looking for a home. And this awareness is very important and part of the whole picture of awareness, advocacy and fundraising that we sometimes speak of. Awareness of all sorts of cries of the earth and of the poor. That is a start along the path to truth and formation of responsive, compassionate hearts in our young people. Advocacy is also a realistic and worthy goal within the faith community, and we know that in dealing with a community made up of adolescents, our significant responsibility is to keep school students on this path as compassionate seekers of truth, so that any individual action or participation later or even now in action for justice movements will be on the basis of independent free will and truth, rather than serving any political leanings of adults in the community. For a school faith community, advocacy will often play out as fundraising of some kind, for example, the Binny's Winter Appeal. This seems to be often the most achievable way in which a student community demonstrates that it cares. And while raising money is not the most important thing, the awareness raising that must go with it around poverty certainly is. Finally, we need an understanding that as a Catholic faith community, we are called, in the words of Walter Brueggemann, to nurture, nourish and evoke a consciousness and perception alternative to that of the dominant culture of consumerism and individualism around us. So now for some practicalities. There are numerous ways to build a consciousness around social justice and ecological conversion, change of heart. Again, I trust that many of these may be applicable in faith communities other than schools. There certainly are plenty of pathways for action in adult communities, and quite simply, this can be about what is doable and the areas of focus that a community is attracted to. First and foremost, the mandate and call of the faith community must be reflected in the policy and other documents of the community. Strategic plan, role descriptions, mission, vision and values documents, a parish vision and mission statement, and so on. Some examples of words from statements with which I am most familiar are these. And we can see here from the principles of MSc education, words such as compassionate engagement, global crises and social justice issues, God's heart on earth, offering hope by drawing deeper meaning from the events of the world in which we live, our responsibility to live lives that allow the spirit of love to be present and in our relationship with the cosmos. Also, in strategic plan document, the broader community recognising that, in our case, the Downlands educational journey will develop selfless leaders who are advocates for values-based communities, staff and students contributing and engaging compassionately with the peace and justice issues of the broader and global community, and development and incorporation of a comprehensive management plan inclusive of a community-wide recycling program, planting, replacement and renewal of trees and gardens, environmental sustainability, enhancement of the local natural environment, and I think most importantly, communal appreciation of connection between respect for persons and care for the environment, all from the college strategic plan. Very useful here can be a guidelines document pertaining to social justice and fundraising, and which includes information that might assist the faith community to understand and differentiate between charity fundraising and social justice, often a problem in schools, with the faith community's principal responsibility and call being to the latter. The broader community usually engages with the other. We can include dedicated national and international social justice days and seasons in the calendar and diary used by the faith community, and we can see some of them here. World Environment Day, the World Day of Migrants and Refugees, Earth Day, NAIDOC Week, Project Compassion, and then there is the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders Sunday, National Reconciliation Week, to name a few. And these in turn can form the basis for school daily prayer on those days or in those seasons. Another practical action can be ensuring that there are posters and notice boards carrying key words and messages, and here the examples we see have been created by us in our community. And we know that when students are surrounded by these implicit messages, they gradually integrate them. Pope Francis's words are in fact included in our recycling bins signage, which is something quite wonderful. And then there are the justice, peace and integrity of creation First Friday intentions that come from the Chevalier family, and which we have begun to share around the school to be on various notice boards and in year group areas. Yet another practical consideration is to have a student or adult social justice group. In our case, this is aptly named the Jules Social Justice Group, as a way to link the charism with the cause. And there's an expectation of all student and adult leaders in the community to lend allegiance to this aspect of school life that is integral to our identity as a Catholic faith community. I should say here that it's good to have a word of warning that when we initiate an environment group in our communities, sometimes what we do is perpetuate the dualism around separation of people and earth. And so really an environment group needs to be part and parcel of a social justice group so that people continually make the links between the cries of the poor and the cries of the earth. We have in our college included the principles of Catholic social teaching in the student college diaries, and these are then accessed easily and regularly by students in the course of their studies. And indeed, Laudato Si is in fact the focus of some tasks in the religious education curriculum. We need to walk the talk through faith in action with various outreach activities, such as, in our case, refugee tutoring and Recce Club at the local state primary school, which is a primary school with a fairly low socioeconomic demographic. Rosie's Friends on the Street homelessness outreach. We know that in building relationships with those on the margins, that compassionate hearts can be formed in our students. Another avenue, perhaps, is in whatever may be the community theme for the year. For example, this year, our theme has been Flourish in Gifts and Grace, and this has offered potential to link this to ecological conversion. And of course, there's connection with the local Catholic Social Justice Commission and the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference, and there are wonderful resources there for schools to use. When we have staff retreat days, we can ensure that we include guest speakers from, for example, Australian Catholic Religious Against the Trafficking of Humans, or from the MSC Prisons Ministry, and we can include matters of the earth topics and activities throughout these days. We can embed Catholic and MSC perspectives in curriculum offerings, inclusive of perspectives concerning the links between poverty and ecological destruction. There are many curriculum areas that lend themselves very well to this, but in all of them it is possible. The vehicle of liturgy is significant here. There is great power in the words, symbols, actions, and images presented during liturgy. In our case, there would always be an acknowledgement of country to commence liturgy, and we have a student who plays the didgeridoo for us at the start of every liturgy. This can ensure that Eucharistic celebrations are faithful to being the table of the world in terms of disadvantaged communities and the need for conversion, transformation of heart. A particular example here would be Catholic Education Week, where here we traditionally have a strong focus on Indigenous culture and connection and care for the land, and all we can learn from that. And certainly a significant learning is our Indigenous peoples, including our Indigenous students, understanding of their relationship with the earth in the words, "The earth does not belong to us, we belong to the earth." The choice of hymns for liturgies can make a difference if we ensure a social justice perspective in our choices, in the lyrics. Whole school assemblies or other gatherings offer the opportunity for very focused change of heart messages to be embedded in the prayer for that occasion. And we can see here a slide that would have headed up one of our assemblies. We began this way, but we took it right through to hopefulness and prayer at the end, but left this for a while for students to ponder. So wherever possible in these times of prayer and in liturgy, we tend to include the words from paragraph 91 of Laudato Si, and we have already heard those from Claude, but these seem to often be the most clear and accessible for the community. Some of the images we see here are ones that we would place in front of students. We know that these are real-world images of suffering and of the crucified people, and to place them in front of our young people is important because we know that in their world they generally don't access these sorts of images. It's not about guilt, it's about awareness and evoking compassionate hearts. To come back to the words that we would embed wherever we can from Clause 91, those words, "a sense of deep communion with the rest of nature," cannot be real if our hearts lack tenderness, compassion, and concern for our fellow human beings. Everything is connected. A further practical avenue can be immersion experiences to places experiencing disadvantage, poverty, and environmental degradation, but always with a consciousness around such experiences not further contributing to this. Immersion experiences in which the staff involved are able to understand and draw out for students the deeper issues at stake. The see, judge, act principle can come to life through these and other experiences. And finally, there is allegiance to Caritas and the MSc Missions Office with their wonderful websites full of resources. During what we call Chevalier Week here, there are activities where the links are made between communities where MSCs are working, and we see that community in Fiji in the 3 images to the left of that slide. So places where MSCs are working that are significantly affected by climate change and our overconsumption. So after context, understandings and practical considerations, it's appropriate to speak a little about challenges that arise in bringing the faith community of a school along the journey of ecological conversion, change of heart. To be sure, most will avow care for people and care for the environment, but normal adolescent development can sometimes be typified by lack of respect in one or the other domain. It falls to educators to make the links between the two. So many of the actions we undertake in the faith community of a school are just a small response to another challenge in our times, what Pope Francis calls the globalisation of indifference. And his words when he was at Lampedusa in 2013 sum this up beautifully, when he says, "Usually when we are healthy and comfortable, we forget about others. We are unconcerned with their problems, their sufferings, and the injustices they endure. Our heart grows cold." And this truth echoes the words of Jules Chevalier, who spoke of the mal moderne, the malaise or disease of the time being apathy and egoisme, too much concern with the self. Another challenge is to bring individuals and the community to an understanding that we cannot say we are respectful people if this is not applied consistently, most especially to the environment. To put it bluntly, we need to challenge students to see that lack of care for their daily school environment may convey a degree of arrogance and self-absorption and a lack of the humility that we profess as one of our significant MSc school values. Again, it's all about making the links. So, as already highlighted and explained, there is a challenge in terms of leading students and the community as a whole, inclusive of parents, to make the links between poverty and lack of care for the environment. We are working hard at this, and one of the best structures at our disposal is something we call the mission lesson, which comes once per term across the whole school, with the content and resources designed to assist students and staff in deepening their awareness and understanding of the world outside of our local concerns, and to make the links between the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. In these lessons, we might use, for example, resources including personal stories about the destruction of the Amazon rainforest, or pollution and poverty in world communities and situations, or resources about rising sea levels in Pacific nations where MSCs are working, as we strive to build an understanding that our ecological footprints can have huge impact on such communities whose own ecological footprint is so very small. In each case, we can access another key value that is part of our MSc charism and the spirituality that flows from it: simplicity. Live simply so that others may simply live, making the links between our consumption at the expense of the poorer nations who suffer the consequences. Creation is God's love story, and everything is connected.
Thank you, Anne, for that wonderful presentation that made practical, concrete, and absolutely possible in every one of our individual lives and in our communities and in our workplaces, the possibility of embedding the wisdom and the vision of Pope Francis in Laudate Si and his invitation to care for our common home. So I thank you very much. We now have another brief opportunity for your input. If you have a raise your hand function, you may like to make a brief comment, or you could put a comment in the Q&A or chat section. We already have a couple that I can read. So as you're thinking about that, let me read this one from Paul Compton. And clearly you and Downlands are doing a beautiful job in raising students' awareness of their personal and community responsibility. But global warming is unlikely to stop without our politicians making decisions based on what you are teaching your students. So there is a role for schools to encourage students to become involved in local politics so they can influence pre-selection, or perhaps one day be pre-selected themselves. Thank you, Paul. Another one here from Sean Cleary. And lovely to hear from the programs at Downlands College in Toowoomba. you might want to comment on this, Anne, I know you have an opinion on it. Have you found a pathway to appropriately manage involvement of students with the Friday Global Students' climate strikes, given that Pope Francis has encouraged the leaders of this, challenging the area for all Catholic schools? Anne, would you like to comment?
Am I being heard now?
Yes, you are.
Yes, all right. All right, certainly in some of our times of assembly and message giving, we have had appropriate slides up around that with Pope Francis greeting Greta, of course, and we have talked about that. There's a very delicate balance to be maintained there between the school being seen as a political entity and as a school espousing Catholic social justice values. Our students certainly are not prevented from participating in those action for justice occasions, and we would encourage it, but we are unable to officially encourage it. Should they wish to participate, they are free to go. They are young people, they need parental permission, we need a permission note. There are all sorts of things to be observed in this space. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Yes, it prompts some thinking. There's a question here from Gabrielle Fogarty that's directed to Claude and to Krish. So we might move to that. And Gabrielle says, thank you for your wonderful presentations. I fear you are preaching to the converted. This wonderful document has come from the head of our church and yet is not being preached or implemented in many of our parishes and churches. This is so frustrating. How do we engage our own leaders? Claude, can we start that with you?
Thanks, Gabrielle. It's a very difficult one as far as I can see, because these are the people really that we look to for for guidance and for direction and setting the priorities that as outlined by Pope Francis, especially in regard to Laudate Si and the bigger questions of environmental care and so on. And yet as I implied in my talk too, we face silence. We don't want to be disturbed. Those qualities that that I spoke about, that in terms of some of the death cults, are actually also in our leaders, in a sense, when they don't want to act, when they don't want to be disturbed, and so on. And who knows what else there is in terms of their cooperation with other forces. That I noticed in one of the comments here, it was an interesting one, that sometime in the future a Prime Minister will reset Parliament's priorities by holding up a baby rather than a lump of coal. And I think it's holding up. I don't know how we can really do it until these people actually have some sort of change of heart themselves. But I resonate with the question very much, Gabriel.
Thank you, Claude. Krish, would you like to add anything?
Thanks, Gabrielle, for the question. I would still go ahead. I mean, certainly, if we waited for leadership, I suppose it can be hard. If we have more than 2 or 3 people willing to start doing something already, certainly maybe it just needs a bit of seeing and witnessing, and who knows, people might come on board. So I'd just like to encourage you, and I mean, it's the same here. We haven't done much for Laudato Si Week 5th anniversary in the diocese, but we certainly mark that on Ascension Day, and we hope to do something for the season of creation. And if it's just this parish, so be it. If it can spread to the diocese, it'd be better. But I suppose it's just getting something done and going from there.
Thank you, Krish. So I think that brings us to the time where we must conclude our webinar, and we hope that you have enjoyed the content that we have offered you as we have explored creation as God's great love story. We hope that it propels you, as it has us, to be more courageous, more urgent, and more active in protecting our common home. And so shall we conclude by praying together the prayer for the earth that Pope Francis uses to conclude his encyclical. The words will come up on the screen, and you may, it's very powerful when we say words out loud. So you've all got your mute buttons on. And how about I lead us in this prayer, and we pray together all over the planet and all over Australia as we ask, God, you are present in the whole universe.
Present in the whole universe. And in this...
Lord, you'll need to mute. Oh, God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love, that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace, that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey on it, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey towards your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace. Amen. And thank you all. Thank you particularly to Krish, to Claude, to Anne, and to Brett behind the scenes for all the work that you've done in this webinar. Thank you very much to all of those who participated. We hope you've enjoyed it.